In addition to using environmental variables and DNS to find a service in GKE, you can also find a service by changing the service type. There are 3 principal types of services: cluster IP, node port, and load balancer. A Kubernetes cluster IP service has a static IP address and operates as a traffic distributor within the cluster. Cluster IP services aren't accessible by resources outside the cluster. Other pods will use the cluster IP as their destination IP address when they communicate with the service. To create a cluster IP service, you need to start by creating a service object by defining its kind in a YAML file. If a service type isn't specified during the creation of the service, cluster IP will be the default service type. Next, a label selector can be used to choose the pods that will run the target application. In this case, the pods with the label of App Backend are selected and included as endpoints for this service. From there, you'll need to specify the port that the target containers are using. For example, TCP port 6000. This means that this service will receive traffic on port 3306 and then remap it to 6000 as it delivers it to the target pods. By creating, loading, or applying this manifest, cluster IP service named MyService will be created. When the service is created, the cluster control plane, which is responsible for managing the cluster's nodes and workloads, assigns a virtual IP address, also known as cluster IP, from a reserved pool of alias IP addresses in the cluster's virtual private cloud. This IP address won't change throughout the lifespan of the service. The cluster control plane selects pods to include in the service's endpoints based on the label selector on the service and the labels on the pods. Alright, so we've established that the cluster IP service is useful for internal communication within a cluster, but what about the external communication? This is where we look at the node port service. A node port service is built on top of a cluster IP service. This means that when you create a node port service, a cluster IP service is automatically created in the process to distribute the inbound traffic internally across a set of pods. So let's say that there's a service that can be reached from outside of the cluster by using the IP address of any node and the corresponding node port number. For this to work, we'll say that traffic through this port would need to be directed to a service on port 80, and further directed to one of the pods on port 9376. Node port service can be useful to expose a service through an external load balancer that you set up and manage yourself. Using this approach, you would have to deal with node management, making sure that there are no port collisions. And finally, there is the load balancer service, which also builds on the cluster IP service and can be used to expose a service to resources outside the cluster. With GKE, the load balancer service is implemented using Google Cloud's Network Load Balancer. When a load balancer service is created, GKE automatically provisions a Google Cloud Network Load Balancer for inbound access to the services from outside the cluster. Client traffic will be directed to the external IP address of the Google Cloud Network Load Balancer, and the load balancer will forward the traffic onto the nodes for this service. The nodes will forward that traffic to the internal load balancer service, and the load balancer service will then forward the request to one of the pods. To create a load balancer service, you need to start by specifying the type, load balancer. Google Cloud will then assign a static load balancer IP address that is accessible from outside your project. When you specify kind service with type load balancer in the resource manifest, GKE creates a load balancer service. GKE makes appropriate Google Cloud API calls to create either an external network load balancer or an internal TCP/UDP load balancer. GKE creates an internal TCP/UDP load balancer when you add the networking.gke.io/load balancer type:internal annotation. Otherwise, GKE creates an external network load balancer.